Hi, Chess.com fans. This is FM Mike Klein coming to you with the next installment of The Principle of Two Weaknesses. Now, it's been a couple years since we released a video in this series. For those of you with long memories, you'll remember that I Am Danny Wrench gave you 5 parts of this awesome idea, and we're going to look at another example today. If you don't remember that video series, the Principle of Two Weaknesses says that in an endgame, you often have to give your opponent 2 things to worry about. That could be a passed pawn on one side of the board and a weak pawn on the other side. But essentially, the further apart those 2 weaknesses are, the better chance you have of winning. If your opponent can focus just on one side of the board, the defense is much easier. So we're going to take a look at an example from one of my own games. This was played when I was a teenager, back at the North Carolina Invitational against National Master Larry Tapper, a guy who I played many times when I was in my youth. So after a pretty boring Petrov, we have a symmetrical pawn structure, and I start to probe his position by playing queen to b3. So he defends his pawn with rook to b8, and now I come up with an idea that doesn't win a pawn by force, but it does force my opponent to play some careful defense. I captured his knight, giving my queen access to d5, and of course hitting his bishop. So he probably should just play bishop takes knight on f3. Even though when I take back, there's opposite colored bishops, his knight does a very good job of guarding all the white squares on his king side. But he played his bishop back to g6, which allows me to trade. And now here, he might still be okay if he throws in the move rook takes rook, although I can definitely understand him not wanting to give me the open file. When he took back, this allows me to win a pawn. Rook takes rook, deflecting his queen, and now he's got 2 pawns without a guard. Queen a5 wins a pawn. So this is going to represent my first weakness. I'm going to be ahead 1 extra pawn on the queen side. We're a long way away from the endgame and from winning this. Queen c6, so I took the pawn. His rook took control of the open file. I tried to get my queen back in the game. He played b6, but actually this just helps my queen. Queen a7 would be silly. He would trap it. But queen a6, and now my queen has access back to the middle of the board. Okay, he improves his knight. Queen to c4, offering a trade. His queen ran away. And before we can use an idea like this, I've just got to get more pieces off the chessboard. So by playing rook to e1, I now either win the file or I trade rooks, both of which are good things for me. Okay, he forced my queen backward. And now his next move made my life really easy. By playing knight f4, it allows me to trade off a whole bunch of pieces. Rook takes rook. Queen takes. And now I've got a couple different ways here I could get the queens off the board. Queen e4 and queen e3 are both possible. I chose e4. That way, when he trades queens, I'm going to be putting my knight on e4 and getting rid of his bishop also. He basically has to. If knight to e6, simply pawn to d5, and he has to resign because he's losing a knight. So we traded queens. I took back. And now another difficult decision. He doesn't really want to keep on allowing the trades, but if he moves his bishop, I get 1 free move to deprive his knight access to the important d3 square, which is where his counterattack is coming from. Maybe I could play a move like knight to e1 or something. Anyway, he decided to go ahead and play knight d3 while he had the chance. This allows me to trade more things, and actually this trade is more than a trade. It also disrupts his pawn structure. These 3 pawns are not bad defensively, if your goal is to make these 3 pawns not be able to create a passed pawn. But once I capture, and his pawn captures back, these 3 pawns are not nearly as good at stopping your opponent from making a passed pawn. My g and my h pawns, if they were able to keep on moving forward one day, you can see very easily pawn h5 would create a passed pawn on the king side. And of course, I've still got my 4 against 3 on the queen side. I should be able to make a passed pawn over there. So in addition to making trades, messing up my opponent's pawn structure was important. Okay, now came some of the most important decisions of the game, and probably the only part of the game where I did not play well. My pawn on b2 is being attacked, but the normal defenses aren't going to work. My king and knight, of course, are too far away. If I play b3, I think he would simply play knight c1, forking my a2 and b3 pawns. The other option is to play b4, but then after knight to c1, he's forking my a2 pawn, and he's threatening knight to e2, which would fork the king and the c3 pawn. So normal defenses aren't going to work here. I've got to get my knight over to his queen side also. The move pawn to d5 allows my knight to get to d4, and once it gets there, I'll be pressuring his pawns as well. There's not much he can do about my knight going to d4, so he played b4, going ahead and saving his pawn. Of course, if I take, his knight takes back, forking the a2 and the d5 pawns, and once he wins my d5 pawn, he'll get a passed pawn as well. So taking his pawn is out of the question. Instead, knight to d4, going ahead and keeping an eye on moving my knight to the square b5. He brought his king over. Again, if I take his pawn, his knight just takes back. And then when his knight takes on d5, he'll also be guarding his weak pawn on c7. So in this position, I had a better move that I didn't play. The computer recommends the very simple pawn to a3. I'm not sure why I didn't play this. Maybe I just didn't see it. It was so simple. After a3, if the pawns trade, I go ahead and get my passed pawn, and I retain an extra pawn. For some reason, I didn't see that and just played knight to b5. His king moved in, and I was a little bit concerned about leaving my queenside pawns, so I played a3 now, and after b3 I realized my knight should have just stayed on d4. So I had to go back, a bit of a waste of time, and that allows black a nifty idea to win his pawn back. He took on b2, I took on b3, he played knight c4, and above all else, I need to keep this pawn. If I don't keep the a3 pawn, I won't even have one weakness to speak of. So, pawn to a4. He forked my pawns, and by now you know which one I wanted to keep. Pawn to a5. He took on d5. Okay, I've got one weakness, the pawn on a5, and it's a great weakness to give my opponent, because he only has a knight. It's not like a bishop endgame, where one of his bishops might be able to cover both sides of the board. But I've got nothing going on over here. It's 3 against 3, and I need to make a passed pawn on the king side to really give myself a good chance of winning. I saved my c-pawn. His knight went to the square b4, and now it's time to figure out how I'm going to make a passed pawn. I played f4, allowing my king to come in behind the pawn. Now at this point, black needs to decide if he's going to be an active defender or a passive defender. I certainly understand what he was thinking. He was thinking to just not let me create a second passed pawn, and his knight would do a good enough job guarding the pawn on a5. However, he might have wanted to switch to active defense here. Probably pawn to d5 is his best chance. That way, if these pawns trade, he gives himself a passed pawn, and he actually gives me something to worry about. Instead, after f5 and my king moved in, he played c5. And although he's building a bit of a fortress, if the fortress doesn't hold, white will be winning easily. Also, by playing c5, he nullifies any chance of making a passed pawn later on. So probably this move was a little bit committal. I'm guessing his idea was to clear a path for his king to walk over here, but that's never really going to happen because he can't really abandon his kingside pawns. Alright, so I continued my plan of going after a passed pawn on the king side. Moved my king in, and played pawn to g4. Now his next move again is probably not the best. I don't think he should be taking my pawn here. It's possible that he just missed my reply. He should probably play a move like king to e6. That way if I ever take him, his king takes back, and I'm not really making any progress on the king side. I still think white has a winning plan in case his king moves to e6. I'm going to maneuver my knight around to the e3 square. That way when I take, he has to take back with the pawn, and I'd get my passed h-pawn. So it might take a little bit longer, but I think king to e6 is still a better defense for black. Instead, he captured, and as I said, he may have just missed which way I was planning on capturing back. Certainly in the beginning and the middle game, we're concerned about keeping fewer pawn islands and keeping our pawns clustered together, but in the end game, it's all about passed pawns. King takes g4 was the move. And now my plan, as you can probably tell, is simple. I'm going to overwhelm his g6 pawn with my f4 and h3 pawn. Not only that, but my king gets to an awesome square on g5, and he can't be driven away. Anytime f6 happens, I happily take the g6 pawn, and I'd be completely winning. Okay, black is really without a plan in this position. Neither of these pawns can move. His king clearly does not want to leave the king side. He doesn't want to push his d6 pawn and give my knight a free pawn with check. So his knight really has to toggle back and forth between a6 and c7 or a6 and b4. So he dropped back. Might as well push my pawn to h4 before doing anything. His knight is just toggling back and forth. And now you can probably see the tactic here for white. These two pawns are both being stopped by one pawn. Pawn f5 check. Simple pawn sacrifice. He captures, and now we have really the best kind of two weaknesses. I've got two rook pawns, as far apart as can be, and my opponent doesn't have any long-range pieces to defend them with, only a king and a knight. So I got my second weakness going, played pawn to h5, and I'm actually close to winning here. If he's not careful, my pawn will just keep going forward, and as we said, he can never play the move f6, because I'll just play king g6, and there'll be a perfect wall formed on the f-file. His king will never be able to cross over. He found a clever way here of not losing right away. His king moved to e5, clearing the e6 square for his knight. So I played h6. He gave a check, which forces my king sideways, and now the black king can get inside the square of the pawn. The pawn has two more squares for promotion, so the square goes two squares sideways. We all know a square has equal length and width. If his king gets inside this square, he'll stop the pawn, which is what he did. King f6. Of course, the drawback of black's plan is that the knight, since it shows the king side of the board to attack on, has abandoned the queen side. So, time to play pawn a6. And the further that pawn gets down the board, the less mobility his knight has. Knight back to c7, a7. Now his knight, of course, is glued to the queen side forever. And he has almost no moves. Let's take a look at black's pieces one by one. Can't move. Doesn't want to move because he'll hang the c5 pawn. Can't move. Better not move or else my h6 pawn wins the game. And if he ever moves the f5 pawn, he weakens e4. My knight would simply get there in two moves. And the minute his king moves out of check, his king will have to leave the square of the pawn, and my pawn would simply win the game. So he only has one piece to move, which is the knight. And the knight only has one square to move to. It's a sad state of affairs, but knight to a8 is the only move. Okay, as far as my pieces go, my king and my two pawns are right where they want to be. My knight has done surprisingly little in this endgame. All we've got to figure out what to do here is where to put my knight to finish off the game. I'll give you a second to pause your video and try to figure out where the white knight on b3 wants to go. The knight's dream square is d5. If my knight gets to d5, I'll actually win on either side of the board. His king will have to get out of check, which means my pawn can make it to the other side. It will also take away black's two squares that his knight can toggle to, and I can probably win by pushing the a pawn also. It doesn't really matter what path we take to get the knight to d5, but I chose d2. His knight just toggled back and forth. Knight f1. Now you might think here that black should go ahead and play f4 to keep my knight out of the e3 square, but as we already said, the minute this pawn moves, e4 is weak, my knight will simply go back where it came from, and when it gets to e4, the king moves out of check, and my h-pawn wins the game. So he decided for one last idea here. His active defense came a little bit too late. He played d5, and when I took, now I've got three pass pawns, and that's not good. He only has two defensive pieces. He's also going to lose the pawn race. Pawn d6, pawn c3. Of course, there's probably nothing wrong with playing knight to e3 here and stopping his c-pawn, but if you do a little bit of calculation, you realize that's not necessary. Played pawn to d7. Again, the knight can't take because of the a-pawn. His king moved back, but then pawn to h7, and we have kind of a picturesque position. I've only got three pawns remaining, and they're all in the 7th rank, all ready to promote, and I've finally overwhelmed black's defense. His pawn went to c2, pawn h8 queen, he got a queen, I got another queen, and it's mate in one. After king to e6, I can choose queen on h to e8 mate, but I was probably going to play queen on h to f6 mate, and at this point, he threw in the towel. So this was a good example where I took kind of a small tactic in the middle game, winning a pawn, made a bunch of boring trades, and then figured out a way to make a second pass pawn on the complete opposite side of the board. Were it not for the ability to create a second weakness, there's a good chance black could have formed a fortress and somehow stopped my A pawn. So this is another good example of the principle of two weaknesses. If you didn't get a chance to see that excellent beginning to the series by I am Danny Wrench, click the link to the right side of the screen where it says Part 5, and you can go back through those links and see the first 5 parts of the series. Before you know it, you'll be able to use this idea in your endgames also. I hope you learned a lot, chess fans. For chess.com, this has been FM Mike Klein.